My name is Matt Olson. I'm a member of the Aspen Institute Homeland Security Group. I'm really excited to introduce our next session. The next session is titled The Security State. It's a title that reminds me of something that Judge Webster said from this stage a couple years ago, and that was, Americans often feel we have too much security until that day that we don't have enough. And I think that quote from Judge Webster really captures the challenge of balancing security and liberty. And a number of the topics that this next panel will address really go to the heart of that fundamental question. So I'm pleased to introduce the person who's going to be moderating this conversation. It's my friend Ken Delanian. Ken covers national security for NBC News. He's had a number of prior positions with the LA Times, the Associated Press, with the Philadelphia Inquirer, USA Today. He spent time in Iraq covering the war there. And with that, Ken, the floor is yours.
Matt, thanks so much. And thank you, everybody. Thanks to the Aspen Security Forum and the Aspen Institute and Clark. It's another great year here. So I guess our task over the next 45 minutes is to examine whether the U.S. has gotten the balance between liberty and security right, as we battle a global extremist threat, and also to look at whether U.S. foreign policy has been over-militarized. And I'm pleased to have a world-class panel here to get into that with you. Gayle Tzemach Lemmon is the Senior Fellow for Women in Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations and the author of the New York Times best-selling Ashley's War, the untold story of a team of women soldiers on the Special Ops battlefield. And then we have Ambassador John Negroponte, Vice Chairman of McClarty Associates, distinguished diplomat, and the first Director of National Intelligence. Elisa Massimino is President and CEO of Human Rights First, which plays a leading role in trying to hold the U.S. to its values. And lastly, Karen Greenberg is the Director of the Center on National Security, Fordham University School of Law. Her newest book is called Rogue Justice, The Making of the Security State. Did you have a role in naming this panel? You're perfect for this panel. It explores the war on terror's impact on justice and law in America. So this is a really interesting moment, I feel like, to get into this aspect, because I feel like after several years of post-Snowden examination of the excesses of the security state, we're at a moment now where the citizens of Europe and the United States are wondering whether they have enough security state to deal with an ISIS threat that is recruiting mentally damaged people in their midst and fomenting terrorist attacks. And certainly that question was asked after Orlando, when it emerged that the killer had been investigated and cleared and taken off a terror watch list. And it's being asked in France with the revelation that the killer of nuns and priests was a known jihadi fanatic who had been wearing an ankle bracelet. I was really struck that Pope Francis, of all people, proclaimed after that attack that the world is at war. So faced with trying to root out these sort of homegrown would-be ISIS terrorists in their midst, governments turn to policies that infringe on liberty. More surveillance, more undercover operations, expanding watch lists. So let me start with Karen Greenberg and ask this question. I mean, some of these ISIS terrorists, the Orlando, San Bernardino attackers, they fit a profile that looks a lot more like Dylan Roof, the South Carolina white supremacist shooter, than say, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. So do you think the U.S. government should be distinguishing between Islamic extremists, ISIS-motivated extremists, and other violent extremists? And is there a way that the U.S. the law enforcement or intelligence agencies can better ferret out these people without infringing further on privacy and civil liberties?
That's a very big question. So first of all, I see ISIS as both belonging to an evolved terrorist threat, and the ISIS presence in the United States, an evolved terrorist threat, and part of a wave of violence that we're seeing that's represented by Dylan Roof and a number of others who are mentally unstable, who pick up a gun, and who may or may not invoke ISIS in the commission of their crime. Almost like a suicide, and they're going to take others down with them, a glorified suicide by cop claiming ISIS, often at the very end. I think it's unfair to put on law enforcement the idea that every single person that evidences some form of mental instability and proclamations of wanting to do violence is somebody that law enforcement has to watch. You have a FBI that has 13,000 agents that cover the United States and the world. You have local police stations like the NYPD, which have 36,000 agents. This is too much for the FBI. So I think to your question, the first question is, ISIS is both an evolution of and different than, particularly in the United States. That makes the task of law enforcement much more complex, and it also calls for more than law enforcement. I think the bottom line here is that law enforcement's activities have to be put into a very distinct lane, and that there is, what was referred to earlier, a very wide civil society space that we have not looked at, that we have not developed, that doesn't need one program and a silver bullet, that needs many different programs that will involve communities in making the world safer and more hopeful for a variety of young people who seem to be disturbed. So I think maybe that answers some of your question.
And so we have a lot of internationally focused people on the panel here, but before we get into the international dimension, does anyone else want to weigh in on the domestic issue of, is there a way to get better at ferreting out these plots without infringing on privacy and civil liberties?
I mean, one thing you can do just to, and some people have talked about this, is focus, as the FBI has often done in al-Qaeda cases, on the acquisition of destructive materials. So whether it's the acquisition of chemical weapons in the al-Qaeda days or the acquisition of firearms, really understanding who's having access to what. And that's something that we know from all of the media coverage we've really failed as a country to do.
Right. Gayle, you were making the point earlier that any crazy person now that associates himself with ISIS and attacks gets a lot more attention than just a regular garden variety.
But yeah, I was recounting a conversation with an Afghan-American interpreter who was injured on the battlefield in 2011. And she is in Orange County, California, and is worried about, she worries about her mom now who wears a headscarf and the way people look at her when she leaves her house. And this is a young woman who is still having limb surgeries 5 years after being injured in an IED explosion for her country. And that moment of her saying, look, any guy now who wants to do something deranged, who gets weaponry, and who then goes on and says, oh yeah, and ISIS made me do it, gets so much more attention, and it causes so many problems. And I just was recounting that story because it's fascinating about how the trickle-down effects change people's lives.
Ambassador?
Yeah, I think we'll never have enough police or law enforcement to deal with these issues, but I think the danger our society faces, that as we work to improve the health of our communities, and as we work to deal with the issue of alienation in our society, which I think are root causes of at least the recruitment factor here in this country, we run the danger of placing excessive reliance on law enforcement and perhaps building it up more than it needs to be built, because we haven't yet found the way to strengthen our communities in order to be able to deal with these problems.
Just if I could pick up on that, just this concept of building up. The other thing that we need to be careful of, I think the threat, the terrorist threat is very serious, and I think in order to take it seriously, we need to be careful that we don't allow this dynamic that you just laid out of, any young guy with a grievance and a gun can elevate that private grievance or mental illness into a great cause by claiming ISIS. And ISIS, of course, is very happy to embrace all of those people. I think we need to be careful that we don't enable that too much, that we don't, anytime we discover the religious affiliation of one of these, so-called lone wolf or self-radicalized people, that we don't make it too easy for that to be kind of part of the grand battle with the great Satan. That does not help us, I think, in our fight against ISIS. If we want to connect up this domestic to the broader issue, being really clear about who we're at war with, that may also, making those distinctions, I think, may also help us when we think about the domestically focused resources that we have to deal with these threats. Right.
Let's turn abroad for a second. Ambassador, as a former director of national intelligence and someone who was posted in Iraq, so there's a caliphate. ISIS is a terrorist organization. It's also an army and a quasi-state that has territory. If the U.S. and its partners were to destroy that caliphate and dislodge them from the caliphate, would the global threat from ISIS be diminished? And if that's true, why aren't we doing it with ground troops, doing whatever it takes to make that happen?
Right. Well, I don't say the threat would go away, and I think that it was discussed earlier in the morning that some of this caliphate activity might migrate elsewhere in the Middle East or to South Asia. But right now, the focus is Iraq and Syria, and I think progress has really been made in the Iraq situation, and I think that's important, and I think it's important that we stick with it. As far as whether we're doing enough, frankly, I had really thought that the president was committed to getting out of Iraq definitively by the end of 2011, and I'm gratified to see that we have maintained the level of involvement in Iraq that we do now, and we actually have advisors. We have advisors able to go down to the battalion level in Iraq and help oversee some of their performance, and we heard General Votel yesterday saying that there'd been a significant improvement of the Iraqi armed forces. So I'm quite hopeful, at least in the short term, about the efforts we are making against ISIL, and I wouldn't underestimate them.
And just because,
and I don't think it needs more ground troops. We've been through that. I don't think it's the American people will tolerate that politically for an indefinite period of time. But I do believe, and Ryan Crocker referred to it earlier with respect to Afghanistan, a politically tolerable, sustainable level of military engagement, several thousands of troops as opposed to several hundreds of thousands, I think is a very good idea.
And just because this is an issue in the presidential campaign, had the U.S. left troops there in 2011, would we have this ISIS threat that we have today, do you believe?
Well, maybe it wouldn't have been as great, but how can you second guess that now? It's happened, and we got to deal with the situation as it is, and I think we've got a good approach to trying to reduce the ISIS threat now.
So, Gayle, President Obama, Hillary Clinton, and others have continually called for more spending on foreign aid and development as an answer to the terrorist problem. You have some experience observing that in Afghanistan. But let me play, you can go on the CIGAR website, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan.
And there are some of those folks here.
You spend a few minutes or a few hours, and you come away with the impression that we didn't get very much for the money we spent there, which is the inflation-adjusted equivalent of the Marshall Plan. So, can we do this stuff? Or should we be doing something different? What's the answer to using development to address terrorism?
Well, one of the questions on this panel, and I'm delighted to be here, was, is the balance too much on the kinetic side versus long-term, economic development, et cetera? And I think we have a timing mismatch. If you look at Iraq, right, you have a short-term problem, which is terrorism, driven by long-term grievances with very little medium-term plan to address it. And I think that is a real concern for me, because having spent 2 years in special operations world and spending a lot of time with people who deploy, yes, we are very good now at countering terrorists, but how do you slay an idea? And if you look at what comes next, the and then what question after territory is liberated from ISIL, the and then what question has not been answered sufficiently. Right now what you see is there's been $7.1 billion spent on the war against ISIL. And of the $200 million pledged for the Fund for Immediate Stability, in the aftermath of that, $81 million has been dispersed as of June. This is a report that just came out from Center for American Progress. $81 million, these are small dollars. And what I worry about is that nation building is a 14-letter word that has become a 4-letter word. And anything that even remotely touches it, including stability, which is basic services, basic security, basic water, basic, parents able to move their children back into their home after 3.1 million Iraqis have been displaced, have all been tainted with the same brush as, we don't want to do that, we can't do that kind of stuff. And what I worry about is it just creates a circle where we have special operations folks who've done 12, 13, 14 deployments being asked again to go in and hit targets. And I worry that if we don't look at the medium and longer term drivers in a smart way that looks at what's happening on the ground, all we do is have a circular effect in terms of what we end up doing.
Elisa, you had a point about that, I think.
Yeah, I think that, back to your point about, the balance and too much military, that question, on, I think it was Wednesday night, right, we heard from Jay Johnson about, how you can kill an enemy but not defeat an enemy. that this has to be about more than the kinetic part. And last night, in those very moving remarks from General Scaparrotti, saying that these decisions to invoke kinetic power have huge implications for our troopers, and that we have to focus more energy on resolving conflicts and fostering peace. So those kinds of things, resolving conflicts, fostering peace, in his words, they are, by definition, longer term, more complex, multifaceted, and those are not things that we as a country necessarily do well, including the funding and oversight of those things. But I think if we're serious about building the kind of world that we say we want for our children, we have got to do that. And I would say oftentimes the debate is between military funding for military action and funding for USAID or other development, State Department. I think we also should be looking at the non-kinetic ways in which our military could have an impact on these questions. There's a new report out by, I think it's Mercy Corps, that looks at the drivers of violent extremism and challenges this question that it's about joblessness and hopelessness, and actually looks at the more significant driver being abuse by security forces. And we have strong military-to-military relations with a lot of, with our partners in the fight against these terrorist groups. And I think there's a lot more that the military could be doing if it fully embraced this concept that respect for human rights is central to peace and security of the world. There are lots of individual folks at the Pentagon who know this and think this. There's not much structurally to give kind of voice and action to it, to implement it. And I think that's one area that could be explored more.
Okay, let me press you further, though. I mean, on this notion of alternatives to military action against terrorism, Ambassador Faley was asked yesterday, okay, well, how do you get at the root causes? And he talked about, I took careful notes, he talked about a platform for dialogue in the Arab world. He talked about infrastructure projects. He talked about education, youth, and technology. Well, that's already all in the USAID state portfolio, right? But it doesn't seem like we're making a dent, Ambassador.
Well, can I jump in on this? The first thing, and speaking as someone who has worked with these issues over the years, but particularly when I arrived in Iraq in the summer of 2004, we had a major $17 billion reconstruction program. The problem was one of sequencing. We were trying to reconstruct a country where the war wasn't over yet, and we had this incipient insurgency, and we were characterizing them as bitter enders, and it would not have any particular consequence. When it turned out, we ended up having sort of a full-fledged insurgency on our hands. So sequencing is very important. If you intervene with development and reconstruction tools when fighting is going on, all you're going to find is that you spend about 50 or 60% of that development budget to protecting the people who are carrying out the assistance programs, and the insurgents who are going to figure out, who know exactly what you're doing, they're going to blow up whatever it is that you've just built the minute you finish building it. But having said all of that, General Votel yesterday talked about the 4 tools or 4 stages, and then he talked at the end about humanitarian. I think he needs to add one so that his approach can converge with Ambassador Faley's, which is reconstruction. We shouldn't do it ourselves. This is a global problem. There is a UN fund for the reconstruction of Iraq, and I think Secretary Kerry just raised a huge amount of money for that at a donors conference the other day. And there has to be a reconstruction phase. If you liberate Mosul and then don't do anything, and I'm sure the town will be in tatters, and if nothing is done to reconstruct it, the same old problem's just going to come back in a matter of months or years.
Yeah, and that's it. All right, so $2.1 billion was pledged at that, and about $125 million was supposed to go back to this fund for immediate stability. Very little is going to medium term, and I think it really is also a question of the American public having a conversation, right? Because for years we haven't even wanted to level with the American public about the fact that people remain deploying to war. Whether you want to say we're a country at war, we are a country who is sending people into situations in Iraq and Afghanistan where people are, 5 U.S. service members were injured in Afghanistan in recent days, right? And I don't think we want to have a national conversation about what that means and what that requires, and to Ambassador Crocker's earlier point about what it means to staying there over the medium term so that you don't have to send huge numbers of troops back there over the longer term.
So Karen, is this a war? I mean, you talk to senior intelligence officials, they say, look, ISIS and the movements can be with us for 15 years. I mean, we're going to be dealing with this. Is this a war? Is this a law enforcement issue, a combination? Do we need to treat this like a nuisance, like traffic accidents and garden variety murders, and stop freaking out every time there's an ISIS attack or an inspired attack?
Okay, so first, just on the war issue. The reluctance of the United States to go to war has been embedded in the war against terrorism for a long time. This is a war that was done without a war tax, without a draft, and now that we have a targeted killing program, is done with less casualties than we've ever seen before, and less American casualties than we've ever seen before. And so it is a war in a whole new definition of what it means to have a war. That's the first thing. The second thing is, it's not just a war. We are definitely at war in the Middle East, in the region, with weapons and troops, et cetera, et cetera. But the war against terrorism, if we want to just give it that definition, is, as everybody here has been saying for years, multi-pronged. And it's partly law enforcement, and it's why the United States government over the past 12 years has virtually reorganized itself so that there is an interagency conversation going on, because this is multi-pronged beyond agencies that we usually think of, not just law enforcement, not just intelligence. It involves everything in our government at this point. It involves Treasury, it involves the Department of Homeland Security, of course, and many other pieces of it. So we are in an active war against al-Qaeda. The question is how far, and I think Elisa can talk about this, how far does that war extend? What are the authorizations for it? And to what extent do other agencies and capacities take over from the military?
Right, Elisa, I think you want to weigh in.
Yeah, I think this is we're sort of having two conversations here, but they, the global issues and the domestic,
Right.
And they are very much linked. They really are, and I think if you want to look at it from the perspective of how do we, because everybody knows that this is going to be a long-term struggle, a challenge for us, not just our country, but the democratic societies across the world. And in order to sustain a level of popular support for this effort, we have to make sure, going back to the title of this panel and the security state and where's the balance and all, that we are leading with our values. That is the way, and it's been in military doctrine for time immemorial, it's in our Constitution. You hear our politicians talk about it, but we need to make sure that our strategies and operations really do reflect the fact that we believe that our values are assets in the battle of, really what is a battle of ideals with these terrorist groups. And so that's got to be reflected in a very real way in how we spend our money, where we spend our money, how we treat people, the threat at home, how we deal with Muslims more broadly. If you think about the rhetoric that we're hearing now around refugees, Islamophobia, all of this, we have to make sure that we are leading with our values. And you can take any piece, whether it's Guantanamo or the use of torture, or how we're dealing with drone strikes and being transparent about when our targeted killing goes awry and kills civilians. All of that has to be part of this effort. And if we center it around our values, we're much more likely to be able to sustain public support for the kind of effort and the length of effort that this struggle is going to require.
Let me just, I want to just,
right.
because I want to just fill in what Elisa is meaning about, leading with our values as our assets. One of the things that we've learned over these however many years is that our values, or what we call our constitutional principles, in many ways make us safer and stronger. And when you have, let's just take a targeted killing policy, specificity matters. hitting civilians, and this is something the Obama administration has focused on, hitting civilians in dozens and dozens and leading to dozens and dozens of casualties makes us less safe. Having broad powers that collect tremendous amounts of metadata and content in our internet and phone communications doesn't help us focus better on what we need to focus on. And torture, I think we can assume that torture doesn't serve us well either in getting information or in, making friends with the rest of the world. And so I think that that's a conversation this country hasn't really had yet, is to understand that specificity and focus and intelligence that is actually trusted is something that makes the country safer, not less safe.
Okay, but let me ask a question about...
Could I just take issue
Yes.
with the statement that our country hasn't dealt with it yet? I mean, we've had new legislation covering surveillance. We've abandoned enhanced interrogation techniques. You even have the actual director of CIA saying, even if I was ordered to use them, I wouldn't. There has been a change, and it's been part of our national dialogue. It may not have been very pretty or very smooth.
I think this is actually a really important point, because I think as a society we know to be true all of these things that Karen just said about how we need to lead with our values and all that, and we almost always come back to it. We almost always it sometimes takes us a long time if you look back in our history, but we in extreme moments where we are under attack and we're fearful, we tend to overreact, which is, of course, that's the strategy of terrorism, is to try to provoke that. And it's important for us to learn from those lessons, that we've, kind of get the pendulum to swing back and start to realize that these values really are assets in this struggle. And when we stray from them, we end up handing a PR tool to our enemies that they very gladly exploit.
Okay, on this point, another change that the ambassador didn't mention is the president's been trying to close Guantanamo Bay. And I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, support that decision. But the Washington Post recently reported that at least 12 former Gitmo detainees launched attacks against U.S. or allied forces in Afghanistan, killing about a half dozen Americans. So I want to ask you guys, in whatever order, does that give ammo to the Republicans who are saying we shouldn't be releasing people from Gitmo, we shouldn't be closing it?
Without question, right? We're in this moment. I would argue we're in a moment of sort of walls versus we. Are we going to have rising walls that really protect ourselves as we feel, right, from the other? Or is there going to be a collective sense of we, right? That we have a community, that there is a community of which everyone is a part, so that the United States has fewer problems with extremism because there is this collective sense of us, right? But Guantanamo and that fact of recidivism, right, or what is happening, feeds into the narrative that this is a war without end. You can't ever let those people, right, those out. And see, we told you this was going soft on this war on terror. And I worry about it very much, because the other part of the problem in closing Guantanamo is who's going to take them.
Well, we haven't done too badly in terms of reducing the population.
Yeah.
Even George Bush, after all, I remember it because I was involved with that part of the policy. 2006, he said, our goal is to close Guantanamo. He's not been able to do it. Congress forbade it, and it still forbids it. So, it's part of the continuing national dialogue, so to speak. But we've gone from 760 or whatever it is down to somewhere around 77. And I'm sure that number will keep going down, and there'll be some point where we get to an irreducible minimum where it'll make sense to everybody to close it. But I don't know when that point's going to be reached.
But there'll be some people who can't be released, right?
Yeah, okay, so this is the interesting thing about Guantanamo. You're absolutely right. There were almost 800. George Bush released 540. President Obama has released another 162 or something. So it's almost closed, right? Almost closed.
90%.
Yeah. It's getting there. The interesting thing that's happened is over the course of this presidency, closing Guantanamo has changed definitionally. It used to mean closing. Now it means keeping the heart and definitional heart of Guantanamo in definite detention and closing the base. Even that is a reach, but that's what we're going to end up with.
Right.
We're going to end up with about just as he's saying, we're going to end up with a very small population before the end of this presidency, a very small population in which Congress, which has banned transfer of Guantanamo detainees for any purpose to the United States, will then be facing a price tag per detainee per year of probably upwards of $11 million, which may or may not matter. I mean, a lot of people say it doesn't matter. Congress has dug its heels in. But I do think it's a matter of time. And then what's going to be left, and we can get to this later, are the military commissions. That, ironically, is going to be the issue with closing Guantanamo.
There is no later because we need to take audience questions, but Elisa, I think you want to weigh in on Gitmo?
Yeah, well, first, I just want to say that this question of so-called recidivism, I think, is a complicated one. And as Karen just laid out, the numbers of people who were released under the Bush administration, much bigger.
Yeah.
And the people who you talked about, most of the people who have, quote unquote, returned to the fight, which again, even that formulation is somewhat questionable, were those who were released under the Bush administration. There's a reason for that, because that was before there was developed a very rigorous, and Matt was involved in it, Matt Olson, who introduced the panel, sorting of the sheep from the goats and figuring out who we really had there and what the dangers that each individual posed. But that said, I mean, of course we have to take very seriously any threat that's posed to American and other innocent lives by the release of Guantanamo detainees. But because of the way we have telescoped in on Guantanamo, and it's become such a symbol for the rest of the world, it's interfered with, as Ambassador Negroponte said, George W. Bush wanted to close it, and there was a reason for that. It was interfering with with our cooperation with our allies. It was being used by jihadists as recruitment, and that is still going on right now. As much as we would like to think that that's kind of old hat, and that was Al-Qaeda, and we're in ISIS world now, the ISIS publications are still looking to Guantanamo and using that to foment. Now, of course, if we took that away, they'd use something else. But why would we inflict this? Right. It's a self-inflicted harm. We can deal with this. We can do it. And besides that, it is so expensive. Yeah. I mean, really, with all of the demands, we talked about the need for development, the need for military operations to deal with the threats that we have now. Why are we spending so much money? I mean, how much is it per detainee now? It's
$5 million.
$5 million.
A year.
When,
if you
all
right, we're running out of time. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Let's take some questions from the audience.
There we go.
Sir. Mike, I think we need a mic, right? There we go.
While we're waiting for the mic, my Afghan colleague used to always point to any barbed wire going up around Kabul and Bamiyan and Panjshir and say, "Oh, it's Guantanamo."
Just an observation. It costs $2 million to send one soldier to Afghanistan. So, and I don't think we're going to be closing. We might close the jail, but we're not going to close the base anytime soon, which is what drives the cost. But my real question is, does it matter if the Guantanamo detainees themselves are not itching to go to Florence, Colorado? Does that matter? And secondly, do we really think that ISIS is going to stop using Guantanamo as a recruiting tool, even assuming it's effective, if we closed it tomorrow?
Okay, do you want to answer first?
No, I just want to say, I think there's really a longer-term issue here, is whether we want to keep using Guantanamo indefinitely as a tool for detaining people, or do we want to find some other solution? I mean, I think that's the real issue.
That's right. I mean, I think that is the issue. To your point, I think in terms of detainees and where they want to be, I'm not really sure that's much of an issue in terms of closing it, other than sending them, to places where they won't be tortured. But there is some indication, and this is sort of related to your question, that a number of detainees would plead guilty, and in which case they would have no say over where they would be held. Put that out there.
Catherine.
Catherine Herridge, Fox News. I have a follow-up on Guantanamo Bay. In the May edition of Inspire magazine, it says the primary tool for recruitment is, in fact, the Arab-Israeli conflict and not Guantanamo Bay. So if the U.S. is determined to close the facility, to what greater benefit is that?
You mean in terms of propaganda?
Well, if al-Qaeda's position is that the primary recruitment tool is the Arab-Israeli conflict and not Guantanamo Bay, that seems to undercut the administration's public statement that we should close it because of the propaganda. So if we're determined to close the base, what is the greater good or goal for the U.S.?
Lisa, do you want to take that?
Well, sure. First of all, that, as I said, there are lots of potential propaganda tools that our enemies use. And one of them continues to be Guantanamo. The spring 2016 issue of Inspire, that's AQAP's publication, talks about Guantanamo as revealing the true values of America. This is, it's a constant refrain. And to your point, Charlie, I don't know that they're going to stop doing that. If we, as General Petraeus has said about, Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, these are non-biodegradable. We should learn from that. that when we make these mistakes, it's a self-inflicted wound that we then have to, account for. But so for sure, it is still, likely to be used. It's still being used now, even though the numbers have gone way, way down. But I think there are a wide range of benefits that we get, and that's why there's been so much bipartisan support in the past. I mean, we tend to forget because in the political season, there's so much division, but there was a time when there was strong bipartisan support for closing Guantanamo, and Republicans and Democrats were, kind of dueling about who would close it faster, day one, no, right now, and that was not because they wanted to cater to terrorists or to let dangerous people go, but because on balance, there was a consensus, which I think is even stronger now because it costs us so much more per detainee to hold them there, that the costs outweigh the benefits. Really, that's just the calculus right now. And I think we're sort of trapped in Guantanamo ourselves against our better judgment and our better interests.
I just want to underscore what the ambassador said, which is that you ask about, going forward with Guantanamo, what's the downside? The downside is ISIS. The downside is using it and reopening it, and which there has been some rhetoric about, and reinvigorating it. And to me, that would be the biggest downside of all. So.
We could do another panel on do we need to capture more terrorists?
No.
We're out of time. Sir, last question.
Al Cannon, Sheriff of Charleston County. This is particularly relevant to my location because we have the consolidated brig there, and your statement that it would in effect potentially be a detention center because of the issue of what do we do with future detainees. And we've held Jose Padillo's probably the most notorious.
I remember.
So that, how do you convince communities that that's something that we ought to do? And even Florence, the Max, is that it's not designed as a whole, a detention center type setting. I think there are. What's your response to that as it relates to communities and having a detention center, not just those residual hardcore individuals that you can't release when you would get down to whatever number, but any future detainees that are brought in?
Okay, so that is such a great question, and there are a number of pieces of the answer. First is I want to tell you an anecdote about Guantanamo Bay, which is that when Guantanamo Bay Detention Facility was open, they called together all the military families that were there, and they told them they were bringing the worst of the worst, which was the phrase that Donald Rumsfeld used at the time. They were bringing the worst of the worst in the war on terror. This is literally weeks after 9/11. And they had a choice. They had children with them. They were used to roaming the base freely. They had a choice. They could stay or they could go home. The United States government would send them home to their other homes. They all chose to stay. They chose to stay, and I've talked to many of them, because they trusted the servicemen who were there, servicemen and women, to protect them. And they weren't afraid of them. So this is one piece that I think is very important. I think the thing you have to say to communities, and this has to do with our entire war on terror policy, even the recidivism issue is, why can't we trust our intelligence and law enforcement communities to keep us safe? Why do we think that terrorists have special powers that are going to break them out of jail? Were there any attempts that you know of to attack Guantanamo Bay during the entire time it's been open? And I think we really need to help our communities think through the issue of, we're safe. We have put $1 trillion into our law enforcement, intelligence, and military capacity, and it is not only much stronger than it was after 9/11, but I think we are strong. And that doesn't mean there's never going to be an attack.
I had just one short thing to this, because I agree it's a very important question, and Americans are right to ask about the security in their neighborhoods. It's interesting though, because it's somewhat warped by the fact that we've had this spotlight on Guantanamo and who these people are for so long, where communities mostly don't know who is inside the prisons in our communities now.
Yeah.
The Blind Sheikh is in a medium security prison in North Carolina next to Bernie Madoff. The American Correctional Association actually got its back up pretty much when it started hearing this, because their attitude was, we know how to do this. Do you know who's in these prisons right now? These are not nice people, including upwards of 400 to 500 convicted terrorists that our federal courts and our federal prosecutors have convicted, while we have limped along with these military commissions at Guantanamo, which should be the trial of the century, is really an embarrassment. So, this is back to the point about faith in our institutions. I think it also requires some leadership on the part of our public figures to say, hey, we know how to do this. We have confidence, we have resources, and we're not going to let ourselves be thrown by a handful of people who ought to be in the dustbin of history.
And that's going to have to be the last word. Thank you all very much, and thanks for listening, folks.